There's something unsettling about watching a man who knows how to kill tend to life instead. The folks of Willow Creek, nestled in the fertile valley of eastern Kansas, didn't quite understand what it was about Michael Carson that made them uneasy. Maybe it was the way his calloused hands, marked with scars that no plow had made, gently cradled seedlings in the spring. Or perhaps it was how his eyes, sharp as a hawk's despite his graying temples, constantly scanned the horizon while he worked his fields. Join me today as we delve into the story of the man they called Silent Mike, whose past would soon catch up with him in a way that would leave the peaceful farming community of Willow Creek forever changed. Before we begin, take a moment to tell us where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories of redemption and justice, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's tale will leave you speechless. Willow Creek, Kansas Territory, 1875. The town wasn't much to look at. A handful of streets branching off from a dusty main road, a general store that doubled as a post office, a small church with a steeple that needed painting, and the usual assortment of businesses that kept frontier life moving forward. What made Willow Creek special was its soil. Rich, black earth that could coax corn stalks taller than a man, and wheat fields that rippled like golden oceans in the Kansas wind. That's what brought Michael Carson there 3 years ago. He'd arrived on a cool September morning, driving a wagon loaded with farming equipment and seeds. Sarah Miller, who ran the general store, remembered his arrival clearly. There was something different about him, she'd later tell anyone who'd listen. The way he asked about land prices, soft-spoken, but every word seemed to carry weight. And those eyes, they'd seen things, terrible things. Carson purchased the old Thompson farm, 200 acres of prime bottomland that had lain fallow since its previous owner died of fever. He paid in gold double eagles that caught the sunlight like drops of frozen fire. Sheriff Tom Wade, watching from his office, noted in his journal that night, "Two kinds of men carry gold like that, those born to wealth and those who've earned it the hard way. Carson's hands told me he wasn't born rich." For 3 years, Carson kept to himself, speaking only when necessary, and then in a voice barely above a whisper. He attended church on Sundays, though he never sang with the congregation. He paid his bills promptly, helped neighbors when asked, and slowly earned a reputation as a reliable, if mysterious, member of the community. But he never joined the other farmers at the saloon, never participated in social gatherings beyond what courtesy required. Life might have continued this way indefinitely, if not for the arrival of the Clayton gang that fateful summer. They rode into town like a storm front, 12 men leading spare horses, their very presence changing the air pressure in Willow Creek. Their reputation preceded them. 3 banks robbed in Missouri, a stagecoach massacre in Iowa, and rumors of worse deeds that decent folks wouldn't discuss in polite company. What no one in Willow Creek knew that sweltering July morning was that Frank Clayton, the gang's leader, had recognized something in the quiet farmer working his fields just outside town. Something in the way Carson moved. Something in those vigilant eyes that stirred old memories. Memories of a legend from the war years, of a Union cavalry officer they'd called Ghost Hand Morgan, a man whose speed with a pistol had become almost mythical among both blue and gray, troops alike. As Clayton watched Carson from the shade of the saloon's porch, a cruel smile played across his face. He'd just found something far more valuable than anything in Willow Creek's tiny bank. He'd found a man trying to bury his past, and Clayton had always enjoyed digging up other people's graves. The warm summer breeze carried the scent of ripening wheat across Willow Creek, but underneath it, something colder was stirring. A ghost was about to be resurrected, and peace was about to be shattered like glass in a Kansas tornado. Stay with me, because this story is just beginning, and what happens next will show you why sometimes the deadliest weapons aren't the ones carried in holsters, but the secrets buried in men's hearts. The Clayton gang didn't waste time making their presence known in Willow Creek. Within hours of their arrival, they'd spread through the town like a virus, taking measure of its weaknesses. 2 men stationed themselves at the saloon, 3 more took rooms at the boarding house. while others scattered throughout the settlement, watching, waiting, gathering information. But Frank Clayton himself had eyes only for the Thompson farm, where Michael Carson worked his fields with methodical precision. "Tell me about the quiet farmer," Clayton asked Sarah Miller at the general store, his voice carrying a false note of casual interest. "The one who bought old Thompson's place." Sarah, no fool despite her friendly demeanor, measured her words carefully. Something in Clayton's tone, in the way his eyes narrowed when he mentioned Carson, set off warnings in her mind. "Not much to tell," she replied, busying herself with arranging shelf items. "Keeps to himself mostly. Pays his bills, grows the best wheat in the county." Clayton's leather-gloved hand came down on the counter, not quite a slam, but firm enough to make the nearby tin cans rattle. "You ever notice anything unusual about him? The way he moves, perhaps, or how he handles himself when trouble comes around?" Before Sarah could answer, Sheriff Wade's heavy boots sounded on the store's wooden porch. Clayton's hand slipped casually from the counter as the lawman entered. "Making new friends, Miss Sarah?" Wade asked, his weathered face pleasant, but his eyes hard as flint as they fixed on Clayton. The outlaw tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy and left the store, but not before Sarah caught the flash of something dark and eager in his expression. Word of Clayton's interest in Carson spread through town like wildfire. By sundown, Matthew Cooper had ridden out to the Thompson farm to warn his neighbor. He found Carson mending a fence, his movements economical and precise, even in this simple task. "Clayton's been asking about you, Mike," Cooper said without preamble, "making it his business to know yours." Carson's hands never stopped working, but something in his posture changed, a subtle shift that made him seem suddenly more present, more dangerous. "That's so?" Carson's voice was soft as ever, but it carried a new edge like steel wrapped in velvet. Cooper shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, remembering all the little oddities he'd noticed about his neighbor over the years. "Folks are saying, well, they're saying he knows you. From before." Carson drove another fence post into the rich Kansas soil, each strike of his maul precise and controlled. "Or knows of you, at least." "Folks say a lot of things, Matthew." Carson finally looked up, and Cooper found himself fighting the urge to back his horse away. Those weren't a farmer's eyes anymore. They were something older, colder, belonging to a different kind of man entirely. Meanwhile, in the saloon, Clayton was holding court, his voice carrying just loud enough to ensure his words would spread. "Ghost Hand Morgan," he said, rolling the name around like fine whiskey. "That's what we called him during the war. Never saw anyone faster with a pistol. They say he once dropped 3 men before the first one hit the ground." The saloon grew quiet. Every ear turned to Clayton's words. "But the real ghost story? That's what happened after the war. Territory near the Missouri border. 7 men dead in one night, all of them ex-Confederate raiders. No witnesses, no warnings, just 7 men who'd done something to cross him, all found with single shots. Right here." Clayton tapped his chest right over his heart. "Story goes he vanished after that. Some say he died, others say he just disappeared, like a ghost." Clayton's eyes gleamed in the lamplight. "But ghosts, they have a way of showing themselves, don't they? When the right person comes calling." Out at the Thompson farm, as darkness settled over the Kansas plains, Michael Carson sat at his kitchen table, cleaning a revolver that no one in Willow Creek had ever seen him carry. His movements were practiced, automatic, the routine of a man who'd done this thousands of times before. Outside, the wheat fields whispered in the night wind, carrying rumors of violence to come. The peace Carson had built over 3 years was unraveling thread by thread, and soon he would have to choose: remain the quiet farmer and watch Clayton's gang tear apart his new home, or become again the man he'd tried so hard to bury. But as his hands moved over the familiar steel of his weapon, even Carson wasn't sure which choice he feared more. Before we continue this gripping tale, if you're enjoying the story of Silent Mike and the Clayton gang, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Now let's get back to Willow Creek, where the past is catching up with the present in ways nobody expected. Dawn broke over Willow Creek the next morning with an uneasy stillness. Clayton's men had spent the night drinking and boasting at the saloon, their voices carrying far enough for everyone to hear tales about Ghost Hand Morgan. Each story seemed more incredible than the last. How he'd once outdrawn 4 men in Dodge City, how he'd tracked deserters through Apache territory, how his left hand moved so fast it seemed to disappear. Sheriff Wade found Dr. Henry Williams on his morning rounds. The old doctor had served in the war, patching up soldiers from both sides. "Those stories Clayton's spreading," Wade said quietly, falling into step beside him. "Any truth to them?" Williams adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles, his face troubled. "I treated a man once during the war. Never knew his name, but the other soldiers called him Ghost Hand. Had this way about him. Calm as still water. But you could feel something dangerous underneath. Fastest thing I ever saw with a pistol." He paused, looking toward Carson's farm. "Funny thing is, he had the same kind of scar on his left wrist that Mike Carson has." The morning brought more changes. Clayton's men began carrying their rifles openly, positioning themselves around town like pieces on a chessboard. 2 took up residence in the hayloft of Cooper's barn, offering him protection money that felt more like a threat. 3 more made camp at the crossroads, stopping travelers to ask directions while sizing up the town's defenses. Sarah Miller noticed Carson's usual Tuesday supply run was different this week. Instead of his regular seeds and tools, he bought ammunition for a rifle she'd never seen him carry, and coffee. Enough for several men. "Expecting company?" she asked carefully. "Always good to be prepared, Miss Sarah," he replied softly, but his eyes never stopped scanning the street through her store window. As he loaded his wagon, she noticed how he positioned each crate to provide cover, how he arranged the supplies to be grabbed quickly if needed. These weren't the actions of a simple farmer. By noon, rumors of Carson's past had spread through town like wildfire. The old-timers recalled hearing about Ghost Hand Morgan, a Union cavalry officer turned lawman who disappeared after dealing brutal justice to a gang of raiders. Young Jimmy Parker swore he'd seen Carson practicing behind his barn, drawing a revolver so fast his hand was just a blur. Clayton, meanwhile, had sent telegrams up and down the line. "Gathering old friends," the telegraph operator reported to Sheriff Wade. "Men with reputations. Gunfighters. Looks like he's building an army." As evening approached, Matthew Cooper's wife Kate noticed smoke from Carson's chimney. Unusual for a summer day. Riding past his farm, she saw him working in his forge, the rhythmic ping of hammer on metal carrying across the wheat fields. The sound reminded her of stories her grandfather told about battlefield blacksmiths during the war, forging not plowshares, but weapons. In town, Clayton held another court session at the saloon. Ghost Hand Morgan had a code, he announced to the gathered crowd. "Never drew first, they say. Always gave a man a chance to walk away." His laugh was cold as winter wind. Course, once the shooting started, he didn't leave anyone walking anywhere. Sheriff Wade spent the afternoon writing letters to neighboring towns requesting help. But he knew help would come too late. The storm was already here, building like Kansas thunder. He could see it in the way Carson's farmhouse stood dark against the twilight, in how Clayton's men patrolled the streets with hungry eyes, in the way mothers called their children inside earlier than usual. As night fell, Carson sat in his darkened house, watching lamplight move through town. Each light represented people he'd come to care about during his 3 years of peace, people who might soon be caught in the crossfire of his past. The weapon he'd forged that afternoon lay wrapped in oilcloth on his table, not a farmer's tool, but a ghost's weapon waiting to be unleashed. The question was no longer if violence would come to Willow Creek, but when. And as Carson watched the darkness deepen, he knew his time of choosing was running out. The first spark of violence came not with gunfire, but with the screech of wagon wheels. 2 of Clayton's men, brothers named Hank and Jesse Burke, intercepted Sarah Miller's supply wagon on its way to Carson's farm. They'd been drinking since dawn, liquid courage making them bold enough to act without Clayton's direct orders. "Ain't safe to be making deliveries out there, ma'am," Hank drawled, his hand resting too casually on his holstered pistol. "Way we hear it, that farmer of yours might be dangerous company." Jessie circled the wagon, eyeing the supplies meant for Carson's farm. Sarah sat straight-backed on the wagon seat, her face composed despite her racing heart. "Mr. Carson's been nothing but a good customer and neighbor," she replied firmly. "Now, if you'll excuse me." Hank grabbed the horse's bridle, while Jessie started pulling supplies from the wagon. Neither man noticed the wheat field behind them stirring in a way that had nothing to do with the wind. "Maybe we ought to inspect these goods," Jessie grinned, tearing open a sack of flour. "Make sure you ain't supplying a known killer with—" The rest of his sentence died in his throat as a quiet voice spoke behind them. The lady said, "Excuse me." Carson stood there, seemingly having materialized from the wheat itself. He wore his usual farm clothes, but something about his stance made both brothers take involuntary steps backward. Sarah later swore she never saw him draw the revolver that appeared in his hand. "Now, boys," Carson continued, his voice soft as falling snow. "I'm sure you meant no disrespect to Miss Miller. But you've spilled her flour, and that's not neighborly." His eyes, flat and cold as river stones, fixed on each man in turn. "You'll want to pay for that." Hank's hand twitched toward his gun. Carson didn't move, didn't raise his voice, but something in his stillness made both brothers freeze. "Your reputation's real then," Jessie managed, his earlier bravado evaporating like morning dew. "My reputation," Carson replied, "is that I'm a farmer who pays his bills and tends his fields. That's all anyone in Willow Creek needs to know." The meaning was clear. This could end quietly if they chose wisely. They chose wisely. Hank dropped a gold double eagle in Sarah's lap, far more than the flour was worth, and the brothers backed away. Only when they were mounting their horses did Carson's revolver vanish as mysteriously as it had appeared. "There'll be more trouble," Sarah said, as Carson helped her gather the spilled supplies. She noticed how he positioned himself between her and the direction the brothers had ridden, how his eyes never stopped scanning the horizon. "Yes," he agreed simply. Then, "I'm sorry, Miss Sarah. Perhaps it's best if you don't make deliveries out here for a while." His voice carried genuine regret, not just for the current situation, but for the peace that was rapidly unraveling. The Burke brothers' story spread through Clayton's gang like wildfire, gaining embellishments with each telling. Some claimed Carson had appeared like a ghost. Others swore he'd moved faster than human eyes could follow. Clayton himself listened with growing satisfaction. Each story, each confrontation, stripped away more of the farmer's peaceful facade. In town, Sheriff Wade received the news with grim understanding. "It's starting," he told Dr. Williams as they shared an evening coffee. "Clayton's pushing, testing Carson's limits, seeing what it takes to make Ghost Hand Morgan show himself." "And then?" the doctor asked, though both men knew the answer. "And then, we'll have a war on our hands." Wade stared into his coffee cup, as if it might hold better answers. "Question is, whose side will folks take when they realize the quiet farmer they've known for 3 years is something else entirely?" As darkness fell, more riders arrived in town, hard men with hard reputations answering Clayton's call. They took rooms at the boarding house, crowded the saloon, their very presence changing the atmosphere of Willow Creek. Each one had heard the stories of Ghost Hand Morgan, each eager to test their speed against a legend. Out at the Thompson farm, Carson moved through his house, extinguishing lamps. In the darkness, his hands traced familiar weapons hidden in familiar places. The time for maintaining his peaceful facade was ending. Soon he would have to decide which man he truly was, the farmer who grew wheat or the ghost who dealt death. If you've been following our story closely, you know things are heating up in Willow Creek. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss what happens next in this tale of a past that refuses to stay buried. The day after the confrontation with the Burke brothers brought subtle but significant changes to Willow Creek. People began looking at Carson differently when he walked down the street. Some drew back, remembering Clayton's stories about Ghost Hand Morgan. Others moved closer, seeing in him a potential shield against Clayton's growing menace. Sarah Miller's account of the incident had spread rapidly, gaining new details with each telling. "Never seen anything like it," she told the breakfast crowd at the boarding house. "One moment the field was empty, the next he was just there. And that voice of his, soft as ever, but it wasn't a farmer's voice anymore." Clayton took the news of his men's humiliation with unexpected pleasure. In the saloon that morning, he gathered his growing band of gunfighters, now numbering nearly 20. "See, boys?" He grinned, pouring drinks all around. "The ghost is still in there, just needed the right provocation to show himself." Among Clayton's new arrivals was a man called Apache Jack, whose reputation for tracking rivaled his skill with a gun. "Want me to watch him?" Jack offered, cleaning his rifle with practiced care. "Learn his routines, find his weaknesses." Clayton's eyes gleamed. "Better idea. Watch who visits him. Anyone bringing him supplies, information, showing friendship, mark them. A man fighting alone is one thing. A man worried about innocent folks caught in the crossfire, that's a man who makes mistakes." Sheriff Wade, seeing the growing tension, called a town meeting in the church. The pews filled quickly, though Carson himself was notably absent. "Clayton's men are watching everything," Wade warned the gathered citizens. "Any interaction with Carson puts you in their sights, but turning our backs on a neighbor isn't the answer either." The debate that followed split the town. Some, like Matthew Cooper, stood firmly by Carson. "He's worked beside us for 3 years," Cooper argued. "Whatever is past, he's earned the right to a peaceful life." Others, led by the banker Mr. Phillips, disagreed. "If he's really Ghost Hand Morgan, he's brought this danger to our doors. Clayton's men wouldn't be here otherwise." Dr. Williams provided unexpected support for Carson. "I treated him once," the old doctor revealed. "Not for any wound. He had a fever last winter. In his delirium, he spoke about Painted Rock Ridge. Anyone who knows the war knows that battle. 23 Union soldiers held off nearly 200 raiders, saved a whole supply train. History records their commander only as Captain Morgan." The doctor's eyes swept the crowd. "A man who'd do that, he's worth standing beside." Meanwhile, Carson himself spent the day fortifying his farm, though few would have recognized his preparations for what they were. He moved hay bales to create clear lines of fire, repositioned his wagon to provide cover, and strategically placed tools that could serve as weapons. Years of military experience guided each decision, transforming his peaceful farm into a defensive position. As evening approached, Sarah Miller made a decision. Despite the morning's events, she loaded her wagon with Carson's regular supply order. Clayton's men watched her every move, making no effort to hide their surveillance. But before she could leave, Sheriff Wade stopped her. "Got word from Maple Grove," he said quietly. 3 farms burned out there last night. No survivors. Clayton's reputation for sending messages isn't just talk. His weathered face showed genuine concern. "You sure about this, Sarah?" Sarah thought about Carson standing in that wheat field, putting himself between her and danger without hesitation. "Some things are worth the risk, Sheriff," she replied, taking up the reins. "Sometimes doing right is more important than playing it safe." As her wagon rolled out of town, more riders were arriving. Clayton's reputation and gold-drawing gunslingers like moths to flame. Each one brought new stories of Ghost Hand Morgan, each eager to test themselves against the legend. The quiet farmer's past was drawing a noose around Willow Creek, and soon, everyone would have to choose sides. The question was no longer whether blood would stain Kansas soil, but how much, and whose. Sarah Miller's wagon creaked along the dusty road toward Carson's farm, each turn of the wheels carrying her deeper into danger. Clayton's men made no effort to hide their presence. 2 riders paralleled her journey from a distance, while others watched from the ridgeline. The message was clear. They wanted Carson to know they were watching, tracking everyone who stood by him. The summer sun beat down mercilessly as Sarah approached the Thompson farm. Carson appeared at his gate before she arrived, his movements careful and measured. She noticed how he positioned himself to keep the wagon between him and the distant riders, how his eyes never stopped moving across the landscape. "You shouldn't have come, Miss Sarah," he said softly, helping her down from the wagon. "Clayton's men burned 3 farms in Maple Grove last night." His voice carried a weight she'd never heard before, the quiet farmer's gentle tone giving way to something harder. So I heard," she replied, starting to unload supplies. "But way I see it, Mr. Carson, a person's either standing for something or they're falling for anything." She paused, gathering her courage. "Those folks in Maple Grove, was that meant as a message to you?" Carson's hand stilled on a crate of ammunition. "Clayton fights his battles through other people's pain," he said finally. "During the war, he led a band of raiders who'd target families of Union soldiers. Made his reputation that way." His eyes met hers. History's about to repeat itself. Meanwhile, in town, Clayton set the next phase of his plan in motion. Apache Jack and 3 others rode to Matthew Cooper's farm, carrying tax collection bags. Cooper had been vocal in his support of Carson at the town meeting, and Clayton believed in teaching object lessons. "Nice barn you got here," Apache Jack drawled, dismounting. "Shame if something were to happen to it." His men spread out carrying oil cans and torches. Cooper stood in his doorway, shotgun in hand, but even he could see the futility of resistance against 4 gunmen. The situation might have turned ugly if not for an unexpected intervention. Sheriff Wade appeared on the road, riding patrol coincidentally in the right place at the right time. "Afternoon, gentlemen," he called, his deputy Wilson flanking him. "Mighty suspicious-looking equipment you're carrying." A tense standoff followed, broken only when Apache Jack laughed it off as a social visit. But the message had been delivered. Supporting Carson carried a price. By sundown, similar visits had been paid to other Carson supporters, though Wade's constant patrols prevented any actual violence. Back at the Thompson farm, Carson helped Sarah load her now empty wagon. "They'll come for you too," he warned. "Clayton won't let anyone stay neutral for long." His hands checked her wagon's wheels and axles with professional thoroughness, looking for any sabotage. "Then maybe it's time you stopped being so neutral yourself," she challenged. "Town's splitting apart while you hide out here pretending to be just a farmer." Something dangerous flickered in Carson's eyes, but Sarah pressed on. "If you're really Ghost Hand Morgan, if those stories are true—" "The stories are true," he cut her off, his voice dropping to that deadly quiet she'd witnessed with the Burke brothers. "That's why I can't be what you're asking. You don't know what I became after the war, hunting men like Clayton. What it cost me. What it cost anyone near me." As Sarah's wagon rolled back toward town, Carson watched Clayton's observers tracking her progress. Each person who stood by him became a potential target, a weakness Clayton could exploit. The peaceful life he'd built was crumbling, and with it, his chances of keeping his darker nature buried. In town, Clayton sat in the saloon, receiving reports from his men. More gunfighters were due to arrive tomorrow, and supplies of ammunition and dynamite were being stockpiled. But his most potent weapon was fear. Fear of what might happen to those who supported the wrong side. The sun set over Willow Creek like a copper penny dropping into darkness, leaving Carson alone with his thoughts and his weapons. Tomorrow would bring more pressure, more threats, more innocent people caught between a ghost and a killer. The time for playing farmer was running out. If you're invested in this story of a quiet farmer forced to confront his violent past, make sure you're subscribed. What happens next will change Willow Creek forever. The transformation began at midnight. In his darkened farmhouse, Carson opened a locked trunk he'd hoped would stay closed forever. Inside lay the tools of his former trade, a gun belt of oiled leather, twin Remington revolvers with pearl grips, and a brass spyglass that had served him through countless battles. His hands moved over each item with familiar reverence. Before dawn, 3 of Clayton's men trying to sneak onto Carson's property disappeared into the wheat field. Their horses returned to town riderless, each saddle carrying a note written in a precise hand. They'll be found at the creek crossing next time. They won't be breathing. Sheriff Wade discovered the men tied up exactly where promised, each disarmed with mechanical efficiency. "Tell Clayton," Carson had whispered to them. "Ghost Hand Morgan sends his regards." The men babbled about a shadow that moved through the wheat, about hands faster than human eyes could follow, about the cold voice that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere. Clayton received the news with predatory satisfaction. "Finally," he said to Apache Jack, "the ghost shows himself." But his pleasure turned to rage when his men described their humiliation. Clayton had built his reputation on fear, and Carson had just undermined it. "Burn the Cooper farm," he ordered. "Not just the barn, everything. Show this town what happens when they back the wrong horse." But before his men could move, Carson struck again. 2 supply wagons carrying Clayton's ammunition and dynamite vanished on the road from Maple Grove, their drivers found unconscious, their cargo gone. In town, the atmosphere grew thick with tension. People hurried through their business, casting nervous glances at Clayton's gunmen who now openly patrolled the streets. But there was something else in the air too. Hope. Carson was no longer simply defending his farm. He was actively pushing back. Dr. Williams, tending to Clayton's unconscious men, noticed details that confirmed his wartime memories. "Same technique," he told Sheriff Wade. "Precise strikes to nerve points, military training combined with something else. Ghost Hand Morgan was famous for it during the war." Sarah Miller, closing her store that evening, found a message tucked under her door. "Keep your shutters closed tonight. Things will get noisy." The handwriting matched the notes left on the saddles. Similar warnings appeared throughout town, delivered to those who had stood by Carson. As darkness fell, Clayton gathered his remaining men. "He's trying to spook us," he snarled. "One man, playing ghost in the dark. Tonight we show him what real terror looks like." He divided his forces into teams, planning to surround Carson's farm under cover of darkness. But Carson was done playing defense. Fire erupted at 3 points around town: Clayton's ammunition cache in the livery stable, his men's horses in the corral, and the storehouse where they'd stockpiled supplies. Each blaze was strategically placed to draw men away from their posts, creating confusion without risking civilian buildings. In the chaos, Carson's shadow danced through town. 2 more of Clayton's men fell to precise shots that wounded rather than killed. Others reported a figure moving impossibly fast between buildings, appearing and disappearing like its ghostly namesake. Every strike targeted Clayton's operations while avoiding civilian casualties. "This is what he was," Dr. Williams explained to a frightened gathering at the church. "A tactical genius. During the war, he'd dismantle entire enemy companies by himself, using fear and precision rather than brute force." Clayton, watching his carefully laid plans unravel, felt the first stirring of real concern. The farmer was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous, a legendary manhunter who had spent years perfecting the art of dismantling criminal organizations piece by piece. As midnight approached again, Carson stood in his dark farmhouse. The familiar weight of his gun belt settled around his hips. The peaceful farmer's calloused hands had remembered their old skills with frightening speed. Tomorrow would bring escalation. Clayton couldn't afford to let this challenge go unanswered. The war for Willow Creek was entering a new phase, and Ghost Hand Morgan was done playing defense. Clayton's retaliation began at dawn. 6 riders approached Matthew Cooper's farm from different directions, this time carrying no pretense of tax collection. Cooper, his wife, and children were eating breakfast when the first shot shattered their window. "Get to the cellar!" Cooper shouted, reaching for his shotgun. But before the violence could escalate, a voice cut through the morning air, cold as winter frost. "That's far enough." Carson materialized from the early morning mist, both revolvers drawn. He'd anticipated Clayton's move, knowing the man's tendency to strike at those who opposed him. The 6 riders found themselves caught in a deadly crossfire between Carson and Sheriff Wade, who'd also predicted Clayton's response. "Walk away," Carson suggested quietly. "While you still can." Something in his voice, in the way he held those pearl-handled revolvers, convinced Clayton's men that discretion was the better part of valor. They rode off, leaving only threats and kicked up dust in their wake. But this was just the beginning. Throughout the morning, Clayton's forces struck at anyone known to support Carson. Sarah Miller's store windows were shot out. The church, where Dr. Williams had defended Carson's character, had its door kicked in. Each incident was calculated to spread fear without causing deaths. Yet, "He's pushing for a response," Carson told Sheriff Wade as they surveyed the damage. "Trying to force my hand." His voice had changed completely now. The soft-spoken farmer's tone replaced by something harder, more precise. "Way I hear it," Wade replied. "Forcing Ghost Hand Morgan's hand tends to end badly for folks." He studied Carson's face. "Those stories true? About what happened to the last gang that pushed you too far?" Carson's eyes grew distant. 7 men one night, all of them raiders who'd burned out homesteads near Fort Scott. Never even saw me coming. He paused. Clayton was supposed to be with them. He'd planned the raids but got delayed. Been hunting me ever since. In the saloon, Clayton was laying out his next move. "Ghost Hand wants to play protector?" He sneered to his gathered men. "Let's see him protect an entire town." He spread a map across the table, marking positions. More gunfighters had arrived, bringing his force to nearly 30 men. But Carson had spent the previous night preparing. Dr. Williams found caches of medical supplies hidden in strategic locations throughout town. Sarah Miller discovered boxes of ammunition concealed in her store's root cellar. Even the church had been subtly fortified, its basement stocked with food and water. "He's turning the whole town into a fortress," Apache Jack realized, watching from his observation post. "Using the same tactics he used during the war." Clayton's face darkened at this news. He'd hoped to isolate Carson, but instead, the Ghost was organizing a defense that involved the entire community. By noon, the battle lines were clearly drawn. Most of the townspeople had chosen sides, either standing with Carson or seeking Clayton's protection. Those who supported Carson found themselves receiving quiet visits, not from the Ghost himself, but from Sheriff Wade or Dr. Williams delivering instructions and preparations. "Tonight," Clayton announced to his men, "we end this ghost story once and for all. No more games, no more warnings." He laid out his plan, a coordinated attack from multiple directions, overwhelming Carson's defenses with sheer numbers. But as Clayton plotted, Carson was moving through Willow Creek like a shadow at noon, positioning allies, setting traps, preparing for the coming storm. The quiet farmer had vanished entirely, replaced by the tactical genius that had made Ghost Hand Morgan a legend. Sarah Miller, watching him slip between buildings with predatory grace, finally understood the full measure of the man who'd hidden behind that peaceful facade. "It's like watching a wolf that's been pretending to be a sheepdog," she told Dr. Williams. "Now the pretense is gone." As evening approached, both sides made their final preparations. Clayton's men cleaned their weapons and drank liquid courage, while Carson's supporters moved to their assigned positions. The Shadow War was about to burst into flames, and Willow Creek would never be the same. The attack began with fire. As darkness settled over Willow Creek, Clayton's men launched burning arrows onto the dry roofs of several buildings. Their plan was simple: create chaos, draw out defenders, then pick them off in the confusion. But Carson had anticipated this tactic. "Water barrels on every roof," Sarah Miller explained to the frightened families gathered in her store's basement. "He had us put them there yesterday. Said Clayton used fire in Fort Scott, too." Above them, they could hear the flames sizzling out as Carson's preparations proved their worth. Clayton's first wave of gunmen advanced under cover of the smoke, expecting to find panic and disorder. Instead, they walked into a carefully prepared killing ground. Carson's voice whispered out of the darkness, "Last chance to walk away, boys." When they kept coming, precise shots rang out from multiple directions. "He's using the whole town as a weapon," Apache Jack realized too late. Carson had positioned defenders at key points, creating interlocking fields of fire. Every advance route Clayton's men tried had been predicted and prepared for. 3 gunmen went down in the first exchange, none dead, but all expertly disabled. Sheriff Wade, watching from the church tower with his spyglass, saw the tactical genius of Carson's defense unfold. The ghost wasn't just protecting individual buildings. He'd turned all of Willow Creek into a complex web of defensive positions, each supporting the others. "Fall back," Clayton ordered, realizing his first assault had failed. But retreat proved as deadly as advance. Carson's supporters, following his precise instructions, had created choke points along every escape route. More of Clayton's men found themselves pinned down by accurate fire from unseen positions. In the darkness, Carson moved like the ghost of his namesake. One moment, he was beside Dr. Williams at the church helping to treat a wounded townsman. The next, he appeared near Cooper's position at the livery stable, adjusting their defensive line. His voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, directing, encouraging, coordinating the town's defense. "This what he was like during the war?" Sarah asked Dr. Williams as they worked to bandage one of Clayton's wounded men who'd been left behind. The old doctor nodded grimly. "Captain Morgan could think 4 moves ahead," he replied. "Turn any position into a fortress, any group of civilians into a fighting force. That's why they really called him Ghost Hand, not just for his speed with a gun, but because he could be everywhere at once, controlling the battlefield like a chess master." Clayton, watching his carefully planned attack dissolve into chaos, felt his rage building. "Burn it all!" he screamed to his remaining men. "Burn the whole damn town!" But even as he gave the order, sharp shots picked off the men carrying torches. Carson had stationed his best marksmen specifically to prevent fire from being used as a weapon. The battle shifted through the streets of Willow Creek like a deadly dance. Every time Clayton's forces thought they'd found a weakness in the defense, Carson's voice would whisper out of the darkness, and precise gunfire would drive them back. His supporters, each carefully positioned and instructed, fought with the coordination of veteran soldiers. "He's not just defending," Apache Jack realized, watching another assault fall apart. "He's weakening us, picking off our best men, forcing us to waste ammunition. This whole town's become his trap." As midnight approached, Clayton's forces had been reduced by a third, most wounded rather than killed, all carefully disarmed and taken to Dr. Williams for treatment. Carson's strategy became clear. He wasn't just protecting the town, he was systematically dismantling Clayton's organization. In the brief lulls between gunfire, those hiding in basements and behind barricades could hear Carson's quiet voice moving through the darkness, directing his improvised army with the skill of a seasoned commander. The peaceful farmer was gone completely now, replaced by the legend that had haunted Clayton's nightmares for years. Ghost Hand Morgan was back, and Willow Creek had become his hunting ground. Before we continue our tale of the ghost who returned to protect Willow Creek, make sure you're subscribed to catch the stunning conclusion of this story. Now, let's see how Clayton responds to his failed initial assault. Desperation can make even the craftiest predator abandon caution. As his carefully laid plans crumbled, Clayton revealed the true depths of his brutality. "Get me the women," he roared to his remaining men. "Miller, Cooper's wife, anyone Carson's been protecting. Let's see how the ghost handles hostages." But Carson had predicted this too. The townswomen Clayton targeted had been moved hours before the battle began, hidden in a series of connected cellars that Carson had spent days preparing. Every time Clayton's men approached a house where they expected to find hostages, they found only empty rooms and deadly crossfire. "He's reading your mind, boss," Apache Jack warned, watching another rescue attempt fail. "Like he knows every move before you make it." Clayton's response was to smash a bottle against the wall. His reputation was crumbling with each passing hour, each failed assault adding to the legend of the man he'd come to destroy. In the darkness, Carson's voice drifted through the smoke-filled streets. "You're running low on men, Clayton. Running low on options, too. Just like Fort Scott." The words were calculated to enrage, to push Clayton into further mistakes. "You don't know anything about Fort Scott," Clayton screamed into the darkness. But Carson's quiet response came from a completely different direction, ghost-like in its movement. "I know you were supposed to be there the night I took down your raiders. Know you've been trying to rebuild your reputation ever since, trying to prove you're not the coward who let his own men die while he was hiding in a saloon 2 towns over." The psychological warfare worked. Clayton ordered a frontal assault on the church where he believed Carson was coordinating the defense. His remaining men, now down to less than 20, charged forward in a desperate attack. But Carson had baited this trap too. Sheriff Wade's deputies, positioned in the bell tower, opened fire from above. Carson's supporters, hidden in adjacent buildings, caught Clayton's men in a devastating crossfire. The street before the church became a killing ground, though Carson's precise instructions ensured wounds rather than deaths. "That's the difference between us," Carson's voice came again as Clayton's men retreated in chaos. "You kill to prove your strength. I wound to prove your weakness." Dr. Williams, treating the latest batch of Clayton's injured men, understood the strategy. "He's not just beating them," he explained to Sarah Miller as they worked. "He's humiliating them. Every man he sends back wounded rather than dead is another crack in Clayton's control." Clayton, watching his force dissolve, turned to his last resort, dynamite. "If we can't have the town, no one will." He dispatched his remaining loyal men to surround Willow Creek with explosives, planning to level every building rather than accept defeat. But even here, Carson was prepared. The ghost's whisper came from the darkness one final time. "Looking for these?" At his feet rolled dozens of dynamite sticks, their fuses removed. His supporters had spent the previous night finding and disabling Clayton's hidden caches of explosives. "How?" Clayton's voice cracked with disbelief. "How are you always one step ahead?" "Because I know you, Clayton," Carson replied, his voice carrying across the smoking battlefield that Willow Creek had become. "Men like you always follow the same pattern. Threaten, burn, kill. It's all you know. But I've spent 3 years learning something different, learning to protect instead of destroy." As dawn approached, Clayton's remaining force had been reduced to less than a dozen men, most of them wavering in their loyalty. The wounded were laid out in Dr. Williams's makeshift hospital, each one a living testament to the precision of Carson's tactics. The next phase of the battle would be personal, and everyone in Willow Creek knew it. Clayton had one card left to play, himself. And Ghost Hand Morgan was waiting. Clayton's final gambit began not with violence, but with silence. As dawn's first light crept over Willow Creek, his remaining men suddenly withdrew from their positions. The abrupt cessation of gunfire left an eerie quiet hanging over the smoke-stained town. "He's up to something," Sheriff Wade muttered, studying the empty streets through his spyglass. Carson, appearing beside him like a shadow, nodded grimly. Both men knew Clayton too well to mistake this for surrender. Their answer came with the thunder of hooves. A single rider approached from the east carrying a white flag. It was Apache Jack, Clayton's best tracker, now serving as his messenger. "Clayton's calling you out, Ghost Hand," Jack announced, his voice carrying across the morning stillness. "Just you and him. Sunrise tomorrow in the wheat field where this all started. Winner takes the town." He paused, then added the hook Clayton had prepared. "Unless you're still the coward who hides in the dark." Carson's response was characteristic. Silence. But Sarah Miller, watching from her store's doorway, saw something shift in his stance. The tactical genius who defended the town was receding, replaced by something older, more lethal. "You can't seriously be considering it," Dr. Williams protested as Carson cleaned his pearl-handled revolvers with methodical care. "Clayton won't fight fair. He'll have men hidden in the wheat, waiting to shoot you in the back." "Of course he will," Carson replied softly, checking the action on each weapon. "Just like he did to those homesteaders near Fort Scott. Just like he's done to every man he's ever called out." His voice carried a certainty that sent chills through those listening. Throughout the day, Carson moved through the town, checking defenses, positioning supporters, as if preparing for another night of siege. But those who knew him best saw the preparations for what they really were: insurance against Clayton's inevitable treachery. "You've got a plan," Sarah said, finding him at sunset near the church. It wasn't a question. Carson turned those haunted eyes toward her, and for a moment she saw both men, the quiet farmer and the legendary gunfighter, warring within him. "Clayton thinks he knows Ghost Hand Morgan," Carson replied. "Thinks he knows all my tricks, all my tactics." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "But he never knew Michael Carson, never understood what 3 years of peace taught me." As night fell, Clayton gathered his remaining loyal men in the saloon. "Tomorrow, we end this," he promised them. "No more ghost stories, no more legends, just lead and blood." His men, those who hadn't already slipped away into the darkness, nodded grimly. But even as Clayton plotted, Carson's influence was spreading through the night like morning mist. Sheriff Wade's deputies moved silently through the wheat fields, mapping hidden shooters' positions. Dr. Williams prepared his surgery, knowing tomorrow would bring either celebration or tragedy. The town itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the final act of this deadly drama. In his farmhouse, Carson sat in darkness, the weight of his gun belt familiar across his hips. On his table lay 2 items: his father's pocket watch, its case still bearing the dent from the bullet it had stopped during the war, and a handful of wheat seeds from his first harvest in Willow Creek. "You were right," he spoke softly to Sarah, who had brought him coffee. "Sometimes a man can't choose between who he was and who he's become. Sometimes he has to be both." The night deepened toward dawn, carrying whispers of the coming confrontation. Clayton's men moved into their hidden positions, thinking themselves unobserved. Carson's supporters took their own places, each one briefed personally by the ghost himself. Tomorrow at sunrise, peace and violence would meet in the wheat field where a farmer had tried to bury a legend, and Willow Creek would witness firsthand why some ghost stories never truly end. Dawn came to Willow Creek like Judgment Day, painting the wheat fields gold and casting long shadows across the battlefield to be. If you've been following our story, you know this moment has been building since Clayton first recognized the quiet farmer for who he really was. Now, we're about to witness the price of peace paid in full. Carson emerged from his farmhouse as the first rays of sunlight touched the weathered wood. Gone were the simple clothes of a farmer. He wore a long black duster, the same one he'd retired years ago. The pearl-handled revolvers rode his hips like old friends coming home. "Still not too late to walk away," Sheriff Wade said, meeting him at the front gate. Carson checked his guns one final time, each movement precise and practiced. "Been walking away too long," he replied softly. "Sometimes a man has to stand, even knowing it's a trap." His eyes scanned the wheat field where Clayton's men lay hidden, their positions betrayed by subtle movements in the morning breeze. Sarah Miller, watching from the relative safety of the church tower with Dr. Williams, saw 2 men approach the field from opposite directions. Clayton strode forward with the arrogant confidence of a man certain of his victory, his silver-plated revolvers gleaming in the morning light. Carson moved like smoke across water, each step measured and deliberate. The farmer was gone now, completely subsumed by Ghost Hand Morgan. Even the way he carried himself had changed. No longer the subtle slouch of a man used to hard labor, but the deadly grace of a predator. "Thought you'd have learned your lesson at Fort Scott," Clayton called out, stopping 30 paces from Carson. "About trying to be a hero." His voice carried across the morning stillness, meant for more than just Carson's ears. "Funny thing about Fort Scott," Carson replied, his quiet voice somehow carrying just as far. "Every man I killed that night died facing me. Can you say the same about your victims, Clayton?" The barb struck home. Clayton's face darkened with rage. "You're still living in the past, Ghost," Clayton spat. "World's changed. These days a man does what he has to do to build his reputation." His hand drifted toward his gun, a gesture meant to draw Carson's attention. "No," Carson corrected him, still deadly calm. "The world hasn't changed. Just your excuse for being a coward." As he spoke, His eyes never stopped moving, tracking the hidden gunman in the wheat. Each position had been mapped during the night, each threat assessed and countered. Clayton's signal was subtle, a slight nod that most would have missed. But Carson had spent 3 years watching wheat move in the wind, and he saw the difference between natural motion and men preparing to fire. The first shot came from behind, just as Carson had known it would. But Ghost Hand Morgan hadn't earned his name by being predictable. He moved the instant before the trigger was pulled, becoming a blur of motion that seemed to flow between the bullets like water through stones. His own guns appeared in his hands as if by magic, their reports thundering across the wheat field. 2 of Clayton's hidden men fell, their shots gone wild. Clayton himself drew with impressive speed, but he was shooting at where Carson had been, not where the ghost had flowed to. "You never understood." Carson's voice came from seemingly everywhere at once, a trick he'd perfected during the war. "A ghost isn't bound by the rules of ordinary men." More shots rang out. More of Clayton's ambushers discovered that their carefully planned crossfire had become a trap of its own. Through the gun smoke and chaos, Sarah caught glimpses of Carson moving with impossible grace, each step placing him exactly where he needed to be. This wasn't just speed or skill. This was art, the deadly dance of a man who had turned violence into poetry. Clayton, watching his ambush fall apart, felt the first real stirrings of fear. He'd come to bury a ghost, and found instead that he'd awakened something far more dangerous, a legend that had learned to grow wheat. The true battle for Willow Creek was just beginning, and Ghost Hand Morgan was done playing by anyone else's rules. The wheat field erupted into chaos as Clayton's ambush transformed into a killing ground. Carson moved like a spirit of vengeance, his black duster seeming to absorb the morning sunlight. Each shot from his pearl-handled revolvers found its mark with surgical precision, disabling rather than killing Clayton's hidden gunman. "You're still soft, Ghost," Clayton shouted, firing rapidly but hitting nothing but air. "Still trying to save everyone." His words were brave, but his voice carried an edge of panic. None of his men's bullets could find their target. Carson seemed to anticipate every shot before it was fired. "Not trying to save them." Carson's voice drifted through the gunsmoke. "Teaching them. Same lesson I taught your raiders at Fort Scott." Another shot, another of Clayton's men down, clutching a wounded shoulder. "Every man you send home alive spreads the story. Makes sure no one forgets what happens when they follow men like you." From the church tower, Sarah and Dr. Williams watched the battle unfold like a deadly dance. Carson's movements weren't just fast, they were precise, calculated, each step placing him exactly where Clayton's men weren't aiming. "Look at his footwork," the doctor breathed in amazement. "He's using the wheat itself. Knows exactly how it moves, how it affects visibility. 3 years of farming taught him things no gunfighter would ever learn." Clayton, seeing his advantage dissolving, played his final card. "Burn it," he screamed to his remaining men. "Burn the whole damn field." Several of his gunmen produced torches, ready to set the dry wheat ablaze. But Carson had prepared for this too. Sheriff Wade's deputies, positioned on the outskirts of the field, opened fire with water-filled bottles, a farming trick Carson had taught them, usually used for pest control. The torches sputtered out before they could catch. "You still don't understand," Carson's voice came again, closer now. "This isn't just a field to me. This is home." 2 more shots rang out. 2 more of Clayton's men fell. "Every stalk, every shadow, every morning breeze, I know them all." Clayton, his nerve finally breaking, turned to run. But Carson was there, appearing like a ghost in the morning light. Their eyes met across 20 paces of wheat-stalked ground, the desperate killer and the farmer who'd remembered how to be a legend. "Draw," Carson said softly. For the first time since arriving in Willow Creek, his voice carried real command, the voice of Ghost Hand Morgan, the one that had directed troops in battle and hunted raiders through the darkness. Clayton drew fast, faster than any man had a right to expect, but Carson moved like his namesake, like a ghost stepping between moments of time. His left hand, The one that had earned him his legend seemed to vanish with speed. The report of his revolver was almost an afterthought. Clayton's gun flew from his hand, his wrist shattered by Carson's precise shot. He fell to his knees, clutching his injured arm, staring up at the man who had once again destroyed everything he'd built. "You could have killed me," Clayton gasped, understanding finally dawning in his eyes. "Could have killed all of us?" Carson holstered his revolvers with fluid grace. "Death's easy," he replied quietly. "Living with your choices? That's the hard part." He turned to the remaining gunmen who had emerged from the wheat. "Take him. Tell everyone what happened here. Tell them Ghost Hand Morgan still haunts these parts." But it wasn't Morgan's ghost that walked back toward the town. With each step, the legendary gunfighter seemed to fade, replaced by the steady stride of a farmer heading home after a long day's work. By the time he reached Sarah and the others waiting at the church, he was Michael Carson again, the quiet man who tended wheat and helped his neighbors. The morning wind rippled through the wheat field, carrying away the last traces of gunsmoke. Behind him, Clayton's men gathered up their wounded and their shattered pride, preparing to spread the story of the ghost who had become a farmer, only to become a ghost again when needed. But this story wasn't quite finished. The legend of Ghost Hand Morgan had one final chapter to write. As our story draws to a close, remember to subscribe if you've enjoyed this tale of a peaceful man forced to confront his violent past. Now, let's see how the legend of Ghost Hand Morgan truly ends. The aftermath of the battle brought changes to Willow Creek that few could have predicted. Clayton and his wounded men were escorted to the territorial prison by Sheriff Wade himself, their legend shattered by the quiet farmer they'd tried to destroy. But the real transformation happened in the town itself, and in the man who had protected it. Carson stood in his wheat field the evening after the battle, watching the setting sun paint the stalks in shades of gold and crimson. Sarah Miller found him there, his farmer's hands once again checking the ripeness of the wheat rather than the readiness of weapons. "Town's been talking," she said, joining him among the stalks that had become a battlefield and emerged unscathed. "Some folks say Ghost Hand Morgan's finally laid to rest, others say he's still here watching over us." Carson smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes for the first time since Clayton's arrival. "Maybe they're both right," he replied softly. "A ghost is just a memory that won't fade, but memories don't have to haunt you. They can protect you instead." Dr. Williams, tending to the last of the wounded before they were transported to prison, shared his own observation with the townspeople. "I treated him in the war," he told them, "and I treated him here. The ghost hasn't changed, we just saw a different side of him. The same hands that can end a fight can also tend to life." The story of Willow Creek's battle spread across the territory, growing with each telling. Some said Ghost Hand Morgan had appeared like a spirit to defend the town. Others claimed a simple farmer had remembered his warrior's skills when needed. Few connected the legendary gunfighter to the quiet man who attended church every Sunday and helped his neighbors with their harvests. A month after Clayton's defeat, Carson received a letter from the territorial governor offering him a marshal's badge. Sarah found him reading it in his kitchen, the silver star glinting on the table beside his pearl-handled revolvers. "Will you take it?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Carson shook his head, folding the letter carefully. "These hands have done enough fighting," he replied. "Time they remembered how to create instead of destroy." He looked out his window at the ripening wheat. Besides, someone needs to bring in the harvest. But people in Willow Creek slept easier knowing that in their midst lived a man who could be both farmer and guardian, whose quiet ways masked a strength that would rise when needed. Children playing in the streets would whisper stories about the ghost in the wheat field, while their parents nodded respectfully to the silent farmer who passed them in town. Carson himself found a peace he'd thought lost forever. The skills that had made him a legend hadn't faded. They'd transformed, turned to new purposes. The same patience that had let him track raiders now helped him read weather patterns. The hands that had been so deadly with a gun now gently tended to new life in the Kansas soil. As autumn approached and the wheat turned golden, Carson stood in his field one last time before harvest. Sarah joined him, their hands meeting among the stalks that had witnessed both violence and peace. "No more ghosts?" she asked softly. "No more ghosts," he agreed. "Just a farmer who remembers, and a town worth protecting." The legend of Ghost Hand. Morgan lives on in frontier tales, but in Willow Creek, they tell a different story. They speak of a quiet man who proved that the hardest battles aren't won with guns, but with the choice to set them aside. They talk about wheat fields that grow taller and stronger, for having been defended by a ghost who found his way home. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind whispers through the Kansas wheat, people say you can still feel him watching over the town, not as a spirit of vengeance, but as a guardian of peace. Because some ghosts don't haunt us, they protect us,